here. So I'm very excited to be able to introduce Dr. Branko Milanovic and his work on income distribution and inequality. Dr. Milanovic is a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality at the City University of New York. He's also a visiting professor there, along with at the School of Economics and at the Barcelona Institute for International Studies. He worked previously as a lead economist in the World Bank's research department and was a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington and has held teaching appointments at various universities, including the University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins University, and Oxford University. And today he's speaking to us a little bit about his most recent book, released in 2019, Capitalism Alone, and about systemic inequalities present in modern liberal capitalist societies. So thank you, Dr. Milanovic, for joining us. I'm very excited to hear your presentation. And whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate actually people coming. It's kind of rather late in Cambridge. So let me go over my presentation. As you mentioned, I would speak about endogenous forces of income inequality increase. And that's based on, lots of that is based on capitalism alone, but there are some additional elements that I have since introduced. So the structure of the talk is, I would first define different types of capitalism, then I would look at sort of this, what I call systemic forces. When I single out meritocratic of liberal capitalism, I'm doing that in sort of opposition to what I call in the same book, political capitalism. Now, political capitalism is capitalism which exists in China. I will not speak about that today, but I just wanted to explain the terminology. Moreover, when I say meritocratic, it does not mean meritocratic in the sense that everybody gets what they deserve. It means meritocratic in the way that John Rawls is using it, is that simply there are no legal impediments to people acquiring different positions in society. So one should not get too excited with the terminology meritocratic. It basically means that you don't have, legally defined castes or social estates or classes. Then I will actually say a few things about the shrinking middle class. And finally, we'll end up with some policy recommendations or conclusions. Some of them are maybe more original than others, but none of them goes beyond, obviously, the definition of capitalism. So let me then define various capitalisms. Now, start with the classical authors like Adam Smith, Ricardo, or Marx. And by the way, they are actually discussed in my new book called Visions of Inequality. So if you actually look at the classical authors, you know that, of course, they divide the population into three classes: landlords, capitalists, and workers. But what is important to define the classical capitalism is essentially the assumption that workers and capitalists, I would leave landlords out for a moment, do not overlap in terms of their income distribution. Now, if you look at this slide, what it shows you there is that income is on the horizontal axis, so level of income. And then you have sort of distributions of workers and capitalists. Obviously, this is not actual. It is sort of a kind of a analytic distribution, if you will. And what you notice here that all workers on that assumption actually are poorer than any capitalist. In other words, there is a very clear, not only class structure, but there is kind of a pecking order where if you own capital, you are not actually going to be poor. And likewise, if you simply own labor power, you're not going to be rich. So this is an important point because it means that the classes are, as I said, sort of ranked and there is no overlap. I have to say just in passing that when we work, for example, with interpersonal inequality and use the Gini coefficient, the overlapping element is extremely important. So in this case, it's very simple. There is no overlap. So it would look, if you do the same thing, but just use a different graph. Again, you put people on the horizontal axis and you rank them by their total income, let's say disposable income. And then on the vertical axis, you actually have level of income. So what you notice is that everybody starts at like very poor people with, I put it here, almost zero income or very low income. And then it goes up to a certain level. And from that level onwards, you have only capital income. And you notice that actually capital income, as is often the case, is distributed more unequally than labor income. That's why I have this sort of exponential increase when it comes to capital income. So that's how it would be in classical capitalism. Now, let's look at how it is in what is called meritocratic or today's capitalism that we know. Labor incomes, I just also draw them very simply. You start with low labor income, and then you have middle level, and then high labor income. But then look what happens now with capital incomes. First, you have about 30 to 40% of the population with zero capital income. So they don't have net capital assets. In other words, they don't have financial wealth. And then you have actually, at some point, you have also people with, they're not shown here, but with moderate amount of wealth, very low rather, or moderate, and then you have a very fast increase in capital income. So what you notice here is at the top, capital income tends to predominate, and at the bottom, there is absolutely no capital income. Now, if you compare the blue line and the red line, which line does show greater inequality? Obviously, the blue line, because lots of people have zero capital income, and some people have very high capital incomes. Whereas labor income, as you notice, is more equally distributed. Simply, the slope of the line, as you can see, is less. Now, let me just make a sort of an experiment and see how you feel first about sort of figuring this out or understanding the logic here. Let's keep the labor income as it was in the previous graph. Now, let's draw the capital income also as rising at the same level, at the same speed rather, as labor income. So notice what happens now. What happens now is that you do have inequality because different people have different amounts of total income. But there, the share of labor versus capital income is constant throughout the income distribution. So this is quite important. If you look at this graph, if you're a rich guy, you might have 400 of labor income and 200 of capital income. If you're a poor guy, you might have 4 of labor income and 2 of capital income. So what do you see there? You see there that inequality between people, measured by standard statistics like the Gini coefficient or the tail index or whatever, can be still high, but the compositional inequality disappears. In other words, it no longer matters if you're a capitalist or a worker for your composition, the composition of your income. But you still have inequality. And that's very important, is that actually you can have a society where you don't have capitalist class as such and labor class as such, and you can still have high inequality. And this is what I call homoplutic capitalism, and I will explain the word a little bit later, meaning that the shares, as you can see from this example, that the shares of capital and labor income are constant throughout income distribution. Of course, that's not the case in real world capitalism, and we will come to that in a minute. So now let me review what I call systemic inequalities in today's capitalism. I will not read them all out because, of course, we will discuss each of them very briefly, and you can obviously read them on your computer, on the slides. So let me go one by one. We start with an important fact, is that the last 30 years have seen an increase in capital share. So this is the graph which shows that for the G7 countries. And notice that from about 1975, whether you weight by total value added or you don't weight it, you have an increase in capital share. The vertical axis shows you the capital share. As you notice, actually, it is now almost 40%, and it used to be about 32%. So that's an important fact just to keep in mind, because lots of things would be derivative from that. You have a rising in the total value added, you have the rising share that belongs to capital owners. And that share you can actually argue, might even further increase with robotics, with artificial intelligence, and so forth. So this is an important fact, which, as I said, would actually have an impact on how we view inequality between individuals. The same is true, and this is simply another example, is that you can see the labor income share declining here among the selected G20 countries. So the decline in the labor share is simply the other side of the same medal of the rising capital share. So that's what we have established. That's the fact. And most likely that fact will continue in the future, as I said before, because of the importance and rising share of capital and replacement of labor by capital, including through artificial intelligence. But then an important thing is to realize that the rising capital share means increasing importance of a fundamentally unequal source of income, which is capital. So when people say, what is the problem with the rising capital share? There is one possibly philosophical or ethical problem, is that the income of the people who actually do not have to work is rising compared to the income of people who have to go to work, like every day, whether they do it physically anymore or do it at home, but they still have to work. So that's a philosophical issue or ethical issue. But there is one economic issue linked with income inequality, is that you have the source that is fundamentally unequally distributed is rising in importance. And that means there is a quasi-automatic spill into higher interpersonal inequality. And I think this is absolutely a key point to keep in mind. In that way, functional income distribution, which is the distribution between capital and labor, gets translated into higher interpersonal income inequality. So if you want to put it in different terms, the high or increasing capital share pushes up the Gini coefficient of interpersonal inequality. And you can see that in the simplest possible decomposition formula of the Gini is the composition of the Gini is shares of the two sources. SL is the share of labor, SK is the share of capital. The two of them add up to 1, obviously. And then the CLs and CK are the concentration coefficients of labor and capital. So if you look at this formula, what is going to happen? S sub K is going to go up because the share of capital goes up. S sub L is going to go down because it's equal to 1 minus the share of capital. And the concentration of capital, which is higher than the concentration of labor, is therefore going to push Gini inequality up. On top of that, it could happen that the concentration of capital itself goes up, which would in additionally push Gini up. So we have really what I call the quasi-automatic transmission to higher inequality. And to see how it looks in real world, look at these 4 countries there. This is all based on Luxembourg income study, and I would urge many of you to actually check that because they have microdata that you can actually download and study now, I think about almost 60 countries, and I think 800 household surveys going back in some cases to the 1960s. And when you calculate the inequality coefficients or Ginis for capital and labor, of course, you always find, as I was saying before, that capital is more unequally distributed than labor. Look at the blue line, which is the Gini coefficient of capital. It is always higher than the red line. Moreover, if you look at that very closely, but it's hard to see it on a slide like this, you would notice the episodes where actually labor income became not more unequal than capital income, but increased in inequality. If you look, for example, at the UK, you see in between 1980s and 2000s, a very significant increase in the Gini coefficient of labor. It goes from about 45 Gini or 0.45 to almost 0.55. So it's a very significant increase. But you notice that capital is almost always, no, it's always higher. Of course, inequality is higher than among, labor income, but it's also increasing, and it's actually very high. The Gini is 0.9. This is an incredibly high Gini. This is a Gini which is equivalent to the situation where you had 90% of people with zero capital income and 10% would share the entire capital income equally among themselves. And essentially, that's the story, is that essentially you have 10% of the population in rich or advanced capitalist countries that has 100% of financial capital. Doesn't include housing, doesn't include your cars, doesn't include the furniture. But if you look at the financial capital, you basically have 10% of people owning the entire financial capital of a country. So you can show that. I'm giving here an example, US, how the US capital income looks like. Notice either that you look at the share of total income at different percentiles, from the left, which is the poorest people, to the right, which is the richest 1%. But notice really at the very end, this blue line that basically, bar rather, that basically skyrockets, because at the very top, of course, capital income is very significant. And as I was saying before, all of the action when it comes to capital income really happens at the top 5% or at most 10% of the population. Or you can actually see it that 60% of income from property is received by the richest income decile, and the bottom one half gets only 5% of all capital income. So this is now a broader definition of capital than the financial, but it is very concentrated, as you can see here. And then, or you can actually look at which point, look at the US, for example, at which point capital income becomes significant. 45% of the population has zero or quasi-zero income from capital. And then between $0 and $100, or in this case also the euros, because I have the German data, as you can see, you have in the US 22% of the people. So essentially, if you add up these two, you have something like almost 70% of the population with really very negligible amounts from capital, which means, of course, as I was saying before, that capital is very heavily concentrated. Capital income is very heavily concentrated, and consequently, wealth is very heavily concentrated. So what happens also is that the people who have more capital than others also tend to have higher return on that capital. That exacerbates the problem, because if you have $1,000 of capital and you go to the bank or somewhere else to actually invest, you would get nowadays, as you know, zero return, or in real terms, probably negative return, because inflation rate may be higher than the nominal return that you get on your capital. But if you have lots of capital, if you have millions, or actually there are people who have billions, then the situation is different, because they invest in assets that are better, even adjusted for risk. They get better advice, and as this graph shows, the rate of return is higher. As you can see, there is a total wealth percentile on the horizontal axis, and the rate of return on each unit of dollar on their assets. So in principle, you could say, why should poor people, if they have $10, they should have the same return on that each dollar as a person who has 1 million. But in reality, that's not the case. People who are richer not only are richer, but they receive higher return on each dollar of their assets than the people who are poor or middle class. So then we come to the third point, or one that I already sort of implied, is the so-called homoplutia. Now, homoplutia, I made up this term from the Greek terms. You know, as you know, whenever there is a kind of a new phenomenon, we go back to Greek language and put together two Greek words. And homo means equal, and plutia means wealth. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon which is really only observed in the advanced capitalism, and that is that increasing percentage of people who are in top income decile are also in top decile by labor income and in top decile by capital income. This is a new phenomenon, as you remember from the beginning of this talk. I was saying in classical capitalism, you have capitalists at the top and workers in the middle and the bottom. But things have changed. Now you have at the very top people who are really rich capitalists, and also they are rich laborers, rich workers. I mean, you can imagine that, and we really don't know. I will show you this, I'll explain these numbers, but we don't know the longitudinal evolution of that. Is it that people inherit quite a lot of money and then they get, good jobs, go to very good schools and get good jobs, and they're really at the top of the earning scale, and also they're actually at the top in terms of capital? Or is it that they go get good jobs, save, and then have sufficient amount of capital to be at the top among the top capital earners? Whatever is the sort of a historical evolution towards that, we do not notice, as you can see on this graph, and I'll explain it, the increasing share of such people. Look only at the blue line, which is the blue dots rather, which is the line for the United States. What it shows you here on the vertical axis is the percentage of people in the top decile who are also in the top decile by earnings and the top decile by capital income. And you notice that that line goes up from 20% in the 1980s to something like 30% today. Now imagine that that line became 100%. That would mean whoever is among the richest decile is also richest decile, is in richest decile by labor and also by capital. Now that means really a full security, in the sense that if things go badly with your capital, you have high labor income to fall upon. If things go badly with your labor income, you have high assets to protect you. So that really, they become sort of invulnerable to shocks. And on top of that, it's more difficult, maybe philosophically, to tax people whose significant part of income comes also from labor. Now, the bottom line here, the other ones I'm not going to explain. The red line is from Spain. The green line is for Germany. They basically move similarly to the US line. But look at the line for Mexico, because Mexico is still more of a classical capitalist case. There are relatively few people who are both rich capitalists and rich workers. As you notice, that percentage is less than 10%, and it's about 1/3 of what we see in advanced rich countries. This is the same story. It essentially shows you that for countries like Mexico and Brazil, you don't have yet, I have to say yet probably, capitalists who are also people with high labor earnings, whereas that's very much the case in richer countries. And you have lined them up here. You can see actually from Italy and the Netherlands and Finland, when you have 26%. This is the average over several years. For the US, 25, and so forth. So that's the new capitalism, if you will. And then you have to ask the following question: how important is this homoplutia as an explainer of the rise of inequality? In a work that they did with my co-author, we actually asked Jonathan Berman. We actually asked the question: how much of the increase in US inequality is due to homoplutia? So Berman and I did this calculation here. You notice first that homoplutia, which is the rising share of people who are both capital and labor rich, is rising whatever sorts of data you use. You have three sources of data: US distributional national account, Survey of Consumer Finance, and Luxembourg Income Study. They are slightly different. The aspects are different, but they all show the rising homoplutia. So then we ask the question: how much of the increase in the US inequality is explained by homoplutia? And as you can see here, we find that about 1/5 of the increase between 1985 and 2020 may be due to homoplutia. So once again, homoplutia is really association among the same people of very high labor and capital incomes, and it is, to some extent, the definitional characteristic of new capitalism as opposed to classical capitalism. So finally, I have to mention something that many of you know and some of you might experience, is that an increasing homogamy or assortative mating. This slide here shows you from the point of view of males with whom they partner. And here we take the top, actually it's based on Nishant Yonzan's work. He takes the top decile of earners for men and looks at whom they partnered with or married over the last 50 years. That was for the US data, and what you notice here in 1970s, the likelihood of marrying the rich partner or the poor partner. The rich partner is, for example, a woman who is rich in the top decile by labor earners, and the blue line shows the percentage of partnerships with a woman who is in the bottom decile. So as you notice, the likelihood of men at that cohort in 1970 marrying a woman from the top or the bottom is about the same. Well, that ratio really now skyrockets to 3-1. And for women, that ratio even increases more. It becomes 5-1. Now, this is in principle, if you look at the origin of this, it is in principle a good development because it shows you greater, in part, this is actually due to the greater participation both in education system and in the labor force of women, and greater freedom to marry or to partner whoever you want with. But it does exacerbate inequality. If you have two high earners marrying each other, it obviously arithmetical inequality would be greater than if the high earner marries somebody or partners with somebody who is actually low earner. So it's a purely arithmetical thing, but it is not negligible. So it is yet another force. So what were the outcomes? I would go briefly over that. Some of them you know, so there is not really something particularly new. This is the share of the middle deciles in market income in 4 countries that are displayed here. What you notice that whatever country practically you take, even Denmark, which has become very popular in the United States as an example of a social democratic country, you do notice the decline in the middle class share. In Denmark, the middle class share is still the highest, and the scales, if you notice the scales on this graphs, plural, are the same. But the decline in the case of Denmark is still present, as it is in the US, where actually the original share was relatively, lower than in Denmark. 32% of the middle deciles have, and that went down very significantly. The decline in the US, as you see, it's about 4 percentage points. There was a decline in the UK, depending what date you take, but from 1980 to 2020 of about 3 percentage points. So that's the outcome. And the basic story, and I would actually stop here, and I will move now to the sort of maybe policy changes. The basic story is essentially illustrated by these graphs. What you do have in the last 40 or 50 years, you have forces that push inequality up, whether it is through reduction in tax rates or replacement of labor by machines or by artificial intelligence or by robots or whatever, or because you have the role of China and Asia through outsourcing. But in any case, the blue line, which shows you the inequality of market income, which means before government action through transfers and taxes, you notice that that blue line goes up. So think of what is happening. If the blue line, which is market income distribution, becomes more unequal, you use the state through redistribution by transfers and taxes to reduce that inequality. And that's the red line, which shows you how much inequality is being reduced in the US and Germany through the action of government transfers. It is pensions, Social Security in the US, unemployment benefits, child allowances, and social assistance. So you notice the red line inequality which is displayed by the red line. Notice the Gini coefficient is on the vertical axis. Inequality is much less. And then with disposable income, you actually introduce also the direct taxation. So you see that the role of the state is indeed important. However, the green line still is increasing, with the exception of the COVID years, which is really very specific case of the United States, where you see the green line going down. But basically, the green line still goes up, not as much as the blue line, but the essential conclusion is that the greater redistribution tries to compensate for the rising market income inequality, but cannot fully compensate for it. And that was the underlying force which drove inequality up. So let me then conclude by sort of pointing out some possible policy changes. Is that with the current capital and labor endowments, each additional point in the capital share translates into a half a Gini point increase in personal income inequality. So this is the story that I mentioned in the very beginning of the talk, is the story of higher capital share translating almost directly into a higher Gini coefficient. Now, how can we weaken that link? You can weaken it by increased taxation of income flows or of the stock or wealth. You can weaken that by taxing wealth, for example, as Piketty and Saez and Zuckman have proposed, or by greater taxation of capital flows or income from capital rather than labor, which used to be the case, that income from capital was more highly taxed than labor. Or the third situation, you can actually break the link by redistributing capital more equally. So this is one possibility, that to focus on what is called pre-redistribution. In other words, to make the concentration of capital or wealth less unequal, to make then the flow of income from that wealth less unequal, and to break this automatic transmission from higher capital share into greater inequality. How can it be done? We know there are some instruments which exist, employee stock ownership plans, although they have their problems, as I mentioned here, non-diversification of risk. They can be also done through greater incentives for small savers, investors, and also through penalties, which means elimination of loopholes for large investors. One of the reasons why you have seen that slide, which shows high rate of return for the top people who have high capital, is because they're also able to avoid paying taxes on that and to use different loopholes, whether within the country where they live or by essentially moving that wealth around countries and around the world. So in other words, the key point in this approach would be to increase capital ownership for some 80% of the people who currently own very little of total wealth, and thereby to break this automatic or quasi-automatic link which exists for the rising from the rising capital share into higher inequality. So let me then stop here, and I think we can essentially, this is a sort of a summary of what one can do with all these policy measures. For some of them, you can do basically nothing, like, homoplutia and homogamy. You cannot order people whom they should partner with. And with homoplutia, there is very little that you can do, because some of the advantages some of the concentration of capital and labor are basically due to the transmission of wealth across generations. So you should actually try to limit the transmission of wealth across generations. You cannot really attack, as it were, homoplutia per se. So as I said, let me stop here. Thank you for your attention, and let's move to the discussion and Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful. I know I definitely learned a lot. I'm sure everyone in the audience did too. I want to give them a question or them some time to ask their own questions and all of that. But before I open it up to general Q&A from the audience, I would like to start with some questions from myself. The first question was, I know you didn't go into this very fully, but you mentioned that there's these two contradicting types of capitalism that exist in the world now. One, which you described here, which is the liberal meritocratic capitalism, and the other, the more political capitalism of China. Do you think that eventually one will outgrow the other, or eventually there will be one global system of capitalism? And is that what we want to see happen?
Well, Laura, that's an excellent question. Let me answer the second question first, because it's really somewhat, how should I say, subjective. No, I actually would not like to see one model of capitalism throughout the world. I think it is actually, the world is too complicated a place. I believe that different parts of the world have different views about economic growth or political system or corruption or role of wealth in electoral process, for example. So I think that having several types is better. And not only is it better, I think it's really quasi impossible to have one type simply because of the diversity of the world and historical differences which exist. Now, will the two of them compete? Yes, I think that actually they are already competing, and they're competing more now than they were competing when I wrote the book. Now they are competing also for geopolitical reasons, not only because they sort of have a different view about what should capitalism be. So we have really an overlap between a geopolitical competition between the US and China, and between two different capitalisms that each sort of believes that it is better and tries to sort of bring or not impose necessarily, but transfer its own way of doing capitalism elsewhere.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for your reply. My other question was, you mentioned Mexico and Brazil a little bit as sort of places that are still working within a more classical capitalist system. Do you think that they're headed in this direction of homoplutia? And do you think it'll be seen in the same way that we see it in rich countries like the US and the UK? Or do you think it is going to end up appearing in different ways?
Well, it seems to me that they would head in the same direction, but I did not have much time today, and actually urge many of you maybe to think about this more than I have. The role of homoplutia is interesting. We take homoplutia as a fact, okay, because we simply see that stuff in the data. But then you ask yourself, is this a good development or bad development, and what does it mean? And as I said before, imagine the extreme case where you'd have the top of the income distribution really composed of people who are also richest in terms, 100% composed of people who are richest in terms of capital ownership and labor ownership. It's a kind of a very strange world. It is the polar opposite of classical capitalism, where you had huge division between workers and capitalists. Here at the very top, you would actually have capitalists and workers unified, as it were, but only at the top, not throughout income distribution. So then you can ask yourself, as I said, this is really a question for people to think more. Is it something that we wish to see? Because in some sense, yes, it is good because they have eliminated this opposition between capital and labor. On the other hand, it is something not so good because they have become really a total elite. They control capital, they control labor, they are the most educated, they have higher salaries, and they have most of capital, and they have high returns to capital. So, we're actually divided as of when I was saying I'm actually divided as to the really, how should I say, social and political meaning of what we observe.
Yeah, that's definitely something to think about. I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. I know we already have a couple in the chat, and I'll start with those. If people want to write them in the chat, they're more than welcome to. If you'd like to raise your hand, I can also call on you. But I'll start with the questions that have been written in the chat first. So the first question that we see is, your graph of Gini inequalities in US and Germany suggests that the Gini of disposable income only slightly increases over the 2 decades. Is the problem of inequality actually overstated? Isn't disposable income inequality a more important measure of how bad life is for the non-rich?
On the graph, depending how, of course, you show the graph, I start here with the Gini of 25, but look at the green line for disposable income inequality in the US. It did actually go from the okay, I'm just saying, reading. It did go from like about 36 to 41. So it's not a negligible increase in Gini. So it's a 5 points increase, or if you will, to put it in relative terms, it's an increase of more than 10%. So it's not true that increase over the longer term was small or negligible. It is true that if you look at the most recent period, probably from after the financial crisis, and especially if you look at the COVID years, inequality did not rise in the US, and it actually went even down in the UK. So this is true, but the decline that you see for the US in 2020 is really due to the huge government transfers which were linked with COVID, and already by 2021 we see a slight increase. So I'm not really taking that decline as a indicative of longer term trends. Notice also an interesting point which you might have, recall even from your own experience. Notice the increase in the US of market income inequality during COVID years, and therefore, also very large government response. So you have the blue line during COVID going up very significantly, but the green line going down. So there was clearly a very strong government redistributary role. But to answer the question once again, I think that the increase over the longer term is real. It is not overstated, but in the last 10 to 15 years, we don't see as much of an increase as we did between 1980s and 2010.
Okay. The second question that we have in the chat is there some relationship between the homoplutia observed in the high income countries and economic performance, GDP growth in these countries in the last decades?
It's a very good question. I really don't know. I have not studied that. It would be interesting to think actually about the channels whereby increased homoplutia will be transferred into income growth. It is very difficult. I have to be quite frank. It is very difficult to establish the links between inequality measured by a synthetic measure like a Gini or tail index and growth. Both synthetic, there are more than 2 synthetic measures, but the most common are Gini and tail indexes. They're too rough to actually capture the essential features. So when you do in the past, people used to do quite a lot of cross-sectional regressions, looking at the Ginis and then rate of growth, and they were generally, inconclusive. So I think that when we want to link inequality to growth, we have to look at really more precise channels, and some people have done that. I would like to point out the work that Sarah Wojciechowski did, actually very interesting, because she looked at the different inequalities, whether it was inequality among the poor people or rich people, and how it affects income growth. So it's much more, I think, complex. The relationship is much more complex than simply putting Gini against the rate of growth.
Yeah, of course. We have someone who raised their hand. Antonis, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes,
Brilliant.
I can.
Brilliant. Dr. Milanovic, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, and also thanks to CSEP for this wonderful initiative. I'm the John Robinson Fellow at Girton College over here, and my work is in political economy. So I find this conversation very, very interesting and very relevant. Now, I have some problem with the terminology that you use. Now, homoplutia, although I think you do the same thing, to go back to Greek, to try to define things in the etymological root of them. You mentioned that homo means equal, but homo does not mean equal, actually. Homo means the same.
Same.
And it means of the same nature. So I am not quite sure that this is what your concept of homoplutia actually designates. Well, if you want to designate same, if you want to designate equal, basically what you mentioned, then isoplutia could work. But I'm not quite sure that this is what you want to designate either. I think that what you wish to designate is different sources of wealth, if I am correct, that you have capital source, and then you have wages in this case. So in this instance, if you want to designate diversity, then Homoplutia could work. If you want to designate total wealth, because you also mentioned that term, that now we have these elites that have basically diversified their sources of income, then Panplutia could work, or Homoplutia could work. Because Homoplutia gives this notion that they have the same kind of wealth. And I think that it's confusing.
Okay, that's a good point. Actually, what I meant is that they're it's not the same kind of wealth, because they are two different wealth. One is capital wealth, another is labor wealth. But they are wealthy in both of them. So that's the basic idea. Isoplutia, I actually thought of that too, but I disregarded it for the reasons that I already mentioned, is that actually it is not equal, it is the same. So they are, let's put it, even in English I find difficult, they are samely wealthy. In other words, they are wealthy in one type and they're wealthy in the other type. Maybe there is a better term. I have to think about that. I mean, the term has already been has taken some of life of its own. And but that's the idea. It's the idea that there are two different types of wealth. One is obviously labor, or two different types of assets. One is labor power, another is capital. And people at the top have abundant wealth in both of them. So they are wealthy in earnings and they are wealthy in returns that capital gives them. But let's see if there is a better term. But as I said, I think it's difficult to zero in on it.
I have added my recommendations on the chat, just in case you want to consider them. And good luck.
Thank you.
All right. We have one more question in the chat. Please keep them coming. One more question that we have in the chat is there a way in which you think that the last surge of inflation has operated some kind of redistribution of income? And if it is, in which direction and through which mechanisms possibly?
You know, I don't know really, because I have not seen the recent work, and inflation is really, this bout of inflation is a rather recent phenomenon. But going back to the 1970s, when inflation or stagflation was the common problem, excuse me, in those days, we did know that inflation was anti-poor or pro-rich, because inflation obviously devalues the most things which are held in nominal terms. And in principle, poor people held more of their wealth in nominal terms. In other words, you need, for example, for everyday purchases, you need a given amount of money to keep. In those days, it used to be like obviously paper money. Nowadays, you might keep it on your bank account. And that money is being devalued through inflation. But if you're richer, you need a much smaller proportion of your overall assets to be kept in assets that are sort of nominally being devalued, because the rest of the assets you can actually go and invest in better ways. And actually, that was what is implied by that steeply rising rate of return as the total amount of assets goes up. So I would say, in principle, I would expect inflation to be pro-rich.
Yeah, that makes sense. While we wait for more questions, I still have some of mine.
Go ahead,
so I can
Laura.
go ahead. So one of my questions that I had was why exactly you think that there was this increase in homoplutia, starting from the 1980s to now. And when you mentioned Germany specifically, that there seemed to be a really large spike in that in the recent times. Do you have any idea why that is, or any theories, I guess?
No, first for the spike, I think it's actually a spike was due to the sort of technical changes in the data collection. This is all based, in case of Germany, is a socioeconomic panel. So all these years going back to 1985 is the same instrument. It's the same survey, but the survey design changes from time to time. So I think this spike is really the result of the survey change. Nevertheless, if you look at the German data, it's essentially an increase, as you notice, from 15 to 20% to something like more 20 to 25%. But the question that you ask is really a fundamental one. As I said, I have not studied that, and with Jonathan, we sort of planned to do this, but never did it. It is the question, like, if we observe homoplutia, and we do observe it, how did it come about? And I mentioned before, so I don't want to repeat that. At least I think we can see two mechanisms, one being through inheritance and then ability later to have a very highly paid jobs. Another one is to have highly paid jobs over a longer period of time. And we look at actually the age of people who are homoplutic, and they tend to be middle age and older, meaning that probably both of these elements worked. And it would be interesting, I think. It's not easy because you need longitudinal data, but it's technically possible, I think, to actually disentangle these two effects. And maybe there is yet another channel whereby homoplutia came about. But yes, it is. It's not the same, because if you had homoplutia coming essentially from people inheriting lots of money and then using family connection and other things to go to good universities and getting good jobs, that's one story. If you have homoplutia arising from the fact that actually people do not start with high parental wealth, but become rich through work and then save, I think there is a difference between the two channels. But I don't know, and we don't know what are the relative importance of the two.
All right. So in the chat, someone asked, you mentioned that higher amounts of wealth receive higher returns in part because they take advantage of offshore tax regimes. Global action on tax havens has become increasingly prominent recently. Do you think this degree of international coordination is likely to succeed in the medium term?
On that, I'm actually quite optimistic, because what has been realized, and particularly in large European countries like France, Germany, I believe the UK as well, is that this tax evasion is essentially damaging very much the countries from where people are able to use that, basically to leverage or to use tax leverage and to move somewhere else and thereby not pay taxes domestically. So it's actually the loss, and I saw the numbers, which are significant. The loss of taxable income is significant, and that would, I think, push the governments to coordinate the policies to crack down on that. And secondly, also our knowledge about the extent of that has become much greater now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So I think there would be some kind of synchronized action, probably already we have seen it at the OECD level, that would crack down on that. It is not going to be seen for other countries, and we would have more and more of, for example, rich Chinese moving their assets elsewhere. Russians have done that in the past, but now with sanctions they have figured out that it was not such a great idea. But other countries with very unequal distribution, like Nigeria, for example, I don't see the crackdown happening there. But it is an international problem, and I think that makes the inequality, in wealth, being exacerbated, and inequality in income as well.
Yeah, of course. Another question that we received is, what do you think of an idea of a progressive capital gains tax? Would that help bring developed economies closer to homoplutia?
Yes, as I said before, the basic story that I've outlined today is really a capital story. It's the story of the rising capital share, which then gets transmitted into the higher income inequality. You can stop that link through different ways. One is tax capital, another tax inheritance, much more than the countries have done so far. The third one is broaden capital ownership. So there are different ways of doing that. Of course, the fourth one is, we were just talking about that, cracking down on tax avoidance, or actually tax evasion in reality. So these are, all of them, I think, are ways of doing it. As I said, I do prefer broadening capital ownership, because I think sometimes ability to impose higher taxes, especially inheritance taxes, has become, that channel has really become closed, in the sense that many countries have, as you know, have even abandoned altogether tax to tax the inheritance. Yes, but I think all four of them, I mentioned four now, and probably there are more, all of them would break this automatic link, or actually weaken the automatic link.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question is, do you think we can address these inequality issues through educating citizens by explaining these problems to them, a grassroots approach?
I'm sorry, through education, or can you say it again?
Through educating citizens by explaining these problems to them.
Oh, yeah, well, certainly. I mean, the knowledge of the problem is really the first step towards solving it. Doesn't mean that you would get to solve it, but if you don't even know that the problem exists, you will not try. I mean, by definition, you are not going to focus on that problem. And in that sense, I think that much greater knowledge about income inequality, much greater availability of data, are absolutely crucial. And we have seen that, because 15 years ago, talking about income inequality would just bring blank stars. People would say, like, what are you talking about? Like, who cares? Actually had friends who were told, when they said actually they would like in the past to study inequality or income distribution, they were told, this is not part of economics. You should go and study that in anthropology or sociology, but not in economics. That has dramatically changed, and I think it has changed simply because of the realization of inequality and the new data that have been assembled and made much more available now. I think big data actually helped the knowledge of inequality quite significantly.
In your presentation, you mentioned that some of these policies that have been used to deal with inequality are now weaker, just because of this new capitalist system that we're dealing with. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, what I meant is the following: is you have an increased capital share, the policies will have to adjust to that, and they have not adjusted. If you have, let's go back to kind of a so-called golden age of social democracy. What you did have then after World War II in Western countries, you had a decline in capital share, and I mentioned that in this new book that I did, Visions of Inequality. That was one of the fundamental reasons why Simon Kuznets believed that inequality in rich countries would go down, because he thought that the share of capital in total value added would go down simply because there is more capital. They would be, if you put like a very simple neoclassical view, they would be diminishing returns to capital. Or if you take Adam Smith, he believed also that the capital share would go down because capitalists will compete against each other much more. And then if you have a decline in capital share, then this whole problem that I was outlining today is much less acute, much less important. Actually, gradually, it might even disappear. If the capital share were eventually to become 10% of the GDP, the problem is relatively small. Then you have other things to, sort of focus on, gap between skilled and unskilled labor, social assistance, people who actually do not have sufficient education, access to education. All of that still you have to focus today, but the capital part is something which is due to the rising share of capital.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you for explaining that. One more question is, do you think that homoplutia can be related to environmental problems observed in the past decades? For example, increases in CO2 emissions? Can the rich in both income and labor contribute to that?
Well, I'm not sure about the link between homoplutia and the rising emissions, but I do know, and we do know that there is almost one I mean, the elasticity of carbon emissions to income is close to 1. I think people have come with different numbers. 0.9 seems to be the accepted numbers. In other words, what I want to say is the following. If your income goes up by 10%, your emissions will go up by 9%. What is the implication of that? The implication of that globally, and of course, as many of you know, I work on global inequality. The implication is that the lion's share of emissions is due to the rich people, essentially. Rich people who consume more goods, and sometimes they consume goods that per unit of dollar are more carbon intensive. So that the link between inequality and emissions is very clear. As I said, it's almost, well, it's behavioral, but it's also arithmetic almost. But how the link works between carbon emissions and homoplutia, I'm not sure. But if homoplutia leads to greater inequality, yes, then it would actually lead also to greater emissions.
Yeah. Another question we have from the chat is, to what extent will the supposed democratization of access to capital markets worsen or improve homoplutia and the declining middle class, especially in line of...
This democratization of access to capital markets has been tried, I have to say, before. It often did not work, partly because of the problem that I mentioned about risk. People who have small wealth, they are not going to actually put all that wealth in assets that might go down in price. And I think there is a room for government intervention there. In other words, I think that a government scheme that would guarantee that small holders would not lose the entirety of their investment would actually go a long way towards incentivizing people to engage into that. It is true that would be basically petty bourgeois capitalism, but when you want to reduce automatic increase in inequality, that petty bourgeois capitalism is a better news than the grand bourgeois capitalism or homoplutia that we have now. But as I said, ESOPs exist, employee stock ownership plans. There are advantages, tax advantages that could be given further. There is also the distribution of shares, but this distribution of shares is generally for the CEOs and the top employees, not for most of the employees. Amazon employees do not get shares in Amazon, but the top CEOs do get shares.
Along that line, you have worked on all of this sort of on the basis of this current type of capitalism, and that this idea that sort of capitalism has beaten the other alternative systems and no longer really has a strong competition in that way. Do you think there is a possibility that capitalism will maybe reach an end or will transform into something different? And if so, how would these issues that we see with homoplutia now, how would those sort of evolve with it?
That's a very good question, because the essential definitional characteristic of capitalism is really ownership of capital and capitalists. So you had socialism which abolished private ownership and thereby essentially ended capitalism. That itself ended in a fiasco. So the question is actually, can capitalism transform itself? Some people thought so, particularly 100 years ago, that essentially it would. And technically, if you were to, as I was saying before, if you were to de-emphasize the importance of capital incomes, if they were to decline, you would have a different system. A different possibility, I mentioned that the capitalism alone, is the system where the entrepreneurial role is really taken over by labor. And this is not totally fanciful. This is what you see today in, for example, in the new companies where you have people who have ideas, they have no money, and they essentially raise funds. Now, look what is new there. What is new there is that the entrepreneurial role, decision-making role, belongs not to capitalists, but belongs to people with ideas who are technically workers. So that's also a different situation because you don't have capital hiring labor, but rather labor hiring capital. So there are different possibilities. As I said, one is the declining importance of capital income per se, and the other one is labor playing an entrepreneurial role and thereby taking away the entrepreneurial role for capital, which is really by definition part of capitalism. So there could be evolutions of capitalism in a sense that really we have a new system or system which would not be fully capitalist as we have it today.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. If anyone has any last questions, please ask them now, raise your hand, or send them out in the chat. I'll give people a minute to type them out if they need to.
If not, I think we can end it for now.
Oh, one last question.
Okay, okay, the last one.
Yeah, this is going to be the last question for today. That question is social wealth funds. Can the state combat inequality generated by Homoplutia by socializing capital returns in this manner? Or any broader comments that you have on SWFs?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea, and that it is possible. There was an idea also in the 1970s or 80s in the Nordic countries to socialize it through the use of pension funds, which will be then managed by the state. So there are, I think, different possibilities of changing this main picture that I have sort of, drawn here. Not to repeat, I actually said the entrepreneurial role of capitalists can be basically taken over by labor. Social funds can be another way of socializing essentially capital, because look at one thing, actually, if you socialize capital, you can technically distribute capital income is still going to exist. You can nationalize capital, but capital income would exist. But that capital income can be distributed to everybody rather than being distributed to those who have capital. So there is, I think, a role for such funds. The question is whether they would be sufficiently large and how effectively they will be managed. So, but yes, technically there is a role for them.
Okay, well, I think that is a great question to end on. Dr. Milanovic, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your presentation and for your time. I definitely learned a lot, and I think this is so relevant to thinking about inequality in the world around us. It was a pleasure to have you talking with CSEP, and we look forward to hosting you again, hopefully at Cambridge in the future. But thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who joined as well.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I wish actually the next time it would be in person. This is a great ways of communicating, but I think in person is still better. So thank you very much indeed. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.